Hey there, thanks for tuning into That Jesus Podcast. I do value you as a listener and am thankful for the many of you who are tuning in again as we reboot our podcast. Today we have an interesting conversation, as promised, with Sheila Gregoire, return visitor. She's talking about sex and purity culture and parenting and things like that. Rebekah joined me as a co-host, and it was a really interesting conversation. I delayed, about 6 weeks before posting it just because I wanted to get some other content out there before we went into the hot button issue that we're going to touch on today. I also wanted to give some time to reflect and think about and read some of the critiques of Sheila's book and some of the other topics we cover. For example, Joshua Butler's book, Beautiful Union. We may have more conversations about that. I do definitely think there's a lot of value here, a lot of good stuff shared. But I did want to take a moment to just remind myself and all of you that Jesus Podcast is sharing voices, perspectives that we think are helpful and interesting and move the conversation forward. Even if we might not agree with every single thing that's shared, it's really valuable and important to hear from these voices to get us out of our thinking ruts. So with that in mind, some of you guys will love this. It's preaching to the choir. Feel free to share that. Love to hear positive reports. And some of you will be scratching your heads and saying, you're really beating a dead horse, or I don't even agree with everything you said, and you'll give some pushback. I want to hear that too. If there's feedback and interest, we will touch on it again down the road. Feel free to share your audio responses, which are always helpful because then I can add them to the podcast if I want to. Feel free to share on WhatsApp or share them on Spotify. And once again, thank you for listening. Here's the conversation. Enjoy it and think critically and keep seeking Jesus. It is great to be back with return visitor, Sheila Gregoire. Sheila is the founder of BareMarriage.com, and she's been working for years in the space about family and relationships, and especially marriage and sex, and that whole evangelical conversation, which as of late has really become, maybe not become more complicated, but it's really reached a certain fever pitch lately in some areas. And Sheila's just released a new book called She Deserves Better. So I'm so excited to have her on to talk about her book and to talk about broader conversations. We also have Rebekah with us too, and can't wait to hear what they'll share and all the sparks that'll fly in a positive way, the sparks of inspiration and brilliance in the conversation. So welcome, Sheila.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So your book, read it. I am a dad. I have one daughter, 3 boys, and the book is very much targeted at moms and their daughters. So I feel like I'm not quite the target audience. Rebekah, you're single. You are a daughter, so maybe more qualified than I am. But both Rebekah and I are coming from a background with a lot of purity culture. And so I think both of us resonated with the content of the book. Some of the authors in the book for me were actually, like, those would have been too liberal for my upbringing.
Same.
Like Joshua Harris. Harris kissing dating goodbye was one thing, but he didn't enter the full, like, parent-led courtship model. So he was a little on the edge for us.
Oh dear.
I would say the same thing as well. Like, many of my friends back home in Malaysia would have read Joshua Harris and been exposed to their version of purity culture, whereas I would have thought they come from pretty liberal churches because we were like into, Debbie Pearl or Bill Gothard, but actually you come out of fundamentalism and the message is the same, and I'm like, I don't get it.
I saw the book really as a tool, not just some, unfortunately stereotyped as some diatribe against purity culture. It's really a tool that people can use. So can you share a bit of the vision for the book?
Yeah, it's not even just about purity culture. It's really about all of the teachings that we give to our kids. So our first big book was The Great Sex Rescue a couple of years ago, came out in 2021. We surveyed 20,000 women to find out what messages common in evangelical circles actually end up hurting women's marital and sexual satisfaction. And it went over great. We had so many women coming to us saying, like, I feel validated, I feel heard. But then the next thing out of their mouth would be, so now I have no idea what to do with my kids because I was taught all this toxic stuff I don't want to pass on the toxic stuff, but I also don't want to say to my kids, go do whatever you want, So like, what do we do? And my team and I, so it's not just me, there's 3 authors on the book. There's myself, my daughter, Rebekah Lindenbach, and Joanna Sawatsky. And so Joanna does the stats, Rebekah writes the survey, does our qualitative research and helps me write. And I'm primarily the writer. And so we decided we would do another huge project. That's what this is. So we surveyed another 7,000 women, whole new survey, to find out what experiences that girls especially have in church and what messages they're told and how those impact us long-term, either for good or for bad. Because again, we want to be evidence-based. We actually take Jesus at his word. When he said a good tree can't bear bad fruit and a bad tree can't bear good fruit, we're like, okay, let's just measure the fruit. Let's stop arguing about this stuff and just measure the fruit. And that's what She Deserves Better is. And I've talked to so many people who aren't necessarily moms of daughters who are just reading it to reparent themselves. Because like, this is what little 15-year-old me should have been told. And we weren't. And so while a lot of it is focused on purity culture, it isn't just that. There's also other messages that are common in the evangelical church that can really mess us up. And we're just saying, hey, let's get Jesus back.
Yeah, and I just want to underline, you really are a powerhouse trio, and it comes through in the book. It's not just that you guys have lots of credentials for the work you're doing, but it all comes together in a really powerful way. And frankly, you might quibble over statistics or details, but it really is some solid research for somebody in a grad program, myself and Rebekah in a doctoral program. Like, this is solid work.
Yeah, that's what we try. And we're working on several peer-reviewed papers right now. Awesome. We presented at the American Physiotherapy Convention on our findings on sexual pain. We're up, our data sets are up at the ARDA. So we're really trying to do it right and raise the bar.
Nice. Rebekah and I were just talking before you came on about chapter 2, which is She Deserves a Big Faith, defining our faith by fruit, not fundamentalism. And this is one of the first chapters that I just got so excited about and was highlighting and all of that. This is really, for Rebekah and I, both kind of adopting a more Anabaptist perspective on Scripture. Is like, yeah, it's about our lifestyle. It's about actually caring for the world around us. So can you drill down on chapter 2 and what you mean by a big faith?
Yeah, so this is something that I think was lost, because when I was a teenager, I was in a mainstream evangelical church. And this is before purity culture. So I'm Gen X. And our faith was so much about evangelism and prayer. And I grew up in Toronto, which is the most multicultural city in the world. We were so focused on how can we help refugees? What can we do to reach out to other cultures in our city? It was very much an outward focused faith. And then something happened. And faith became almost entirely about making sure that you're a virgin. And it's not that we didn't believe in saving sex for marriage when I was a teenager. It's just, it wasn't the primary thing we talked about. It was kind of like an incidental thing. Well, yeah, everybody knows that. But the main thing that we do is we pray and we figure out how to tell our testimony. And it's like today, instead of Christianity being defined by how we love those around us, Christianity is now a set of beliefs. And so you have to believe in 7-day creation and that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and you need to vote for a certain political party, and you need to believe this about any number of issues, whether it's gun control in the US or whatever, or else you're not a Christian. And it's kind of like Jesus, we've lost the point of what Jesus said. Where is caring for the widow and orphan? Where is the pure religion? Where is they will know us by our love? It's not there. And when we reduce faith to just a whole bunch of a checklist of things that you need to believe, then people can say, yeah, I'm a Christian because I vote for the right political party and I stand on the right side of this issue, even though I am terrible to all the people around me. And that is not a Christian.
Yeah, Rebekah, you're coming from an interesting intersection from an international place, which means not the US or Canada, from Malaysia, but very much steeped in a sort of fundamentalist Christianity at some points in your life. How did this chapter strike you, especially with the emphasis on there's one right way to be a Christian, and the focus is that you believe these things rather than that you're doing these things?
Yeah, I think there are ebbs and flows in the whole like political / fundamentalist thing, and a lot of my research has to do with this disproportionate aggressive reach of the political elements taking over theology and taking over beliefs about, say, family and gender and all that. And it is so very, very much an imperial imposition. It's about America being, being superior culturally, religiously, and restoring that in order to maintain economic dominance. And that has had a huge impact. So one of my recent pieces of research that I've been working on looks at global Christianities and what are the messages that have been that have impacted, and fundamentalism is one of them, like a staunch, very specific biblical interpretation, along with things like the prosperity gospel, along with sort of a very strong emphasis on Christians gaining political dominion in order to enforce certain beliefs about women and families and all that. And so that's really interesting to explore, and I would almost say, yeah, that's happening. And what I thought about reading that book is a thought that has been with me for quite a while in the Christian world. Reading that chapter was that graphic image of all the words that are prominent in writings for Christian girls. Like, I think the second most used word was sex, and
this is the second most used word in Christian material for teen girls.
Yes, Christian material for teen girls, like sex, marriage, and of course purity and all these things versus what's in the New Testament. And that did occur to me, like it's kind of strange that the topic of Christian content for girls is very similar to the topic of secular magazines talking about sex, dating, fashion, how you look, and it reduces who you are. It just is a different version of that, but it reduces your Christian faith, your identity, to just these superficial, less important things than what the New Testament actually focuses about.
Yeah. So can you walk us through, Sheila, how you in your book and with your co-writers would break down this, you call them tricky teachings, how you might walk through that with your daughter, or even stretching it with your son?
Yeah, and I hope, we've heard from a lot of women who are working through the exercises with their boys too. It really is addressed to girls, just because I think girls have gotten the worst of this, and boys have gotten messages in a negative way, but in a different way. And perhaps we'll do a book for boys one day too, I'm not sure. But, we call tricky teachings these ideas that they sound right, like they're almost there. And so they're really easy to believe, but there's just something that isn't quite right about them. And which is kind of a lot of evangelicalism right now, and a lot of the messages that our girls hear. And so in a lot of our exercises, we'll include a tricky teaching, and then we'll ask girls, okay, how would someone reconcile this if they weren't in your situation? Like, what if a girl had depression? What if she came from, a family that was abusive? How would she think of these kinds of messages? So things like, the idea that you need to be joyful in the Lord, and in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God. Like, these things that we often say is spiritual bypassing. So, someone will be upset about something legitimately, and our reply will be to quote a Bible verse at them, which is a way of shutting them up. So I don't want to deal with your emotions. Your emotions are uncomfortable to me. And so I'm just going to give a Bible verse that will shut you up. And we do that with so many different areas with our kids, is we're really uncomfortable with our kids' feelings, with our kids' emotions. And so we would rather just them be quiet. And we see that especially around the concept of depression or anxiety, or even just anger. Women aren't really allowed to be angry either. But yeah, we've got to make sure that girls don't express these negative, quote unquote, emotions, and instead are always joyful. And so let's break that down. Was Jesus like that? Is God like that? Because Jesus showed an awful lot of emotions. If Jeremiah was never depressed, he wouldn't have written Lamentations. Yeah. So we've got to get more real and just acknowledge that our girls have feelings and they are allowed to, and they are allowed to speak those, because girls simply must be permitted to have a voice, because all too often we try to silence girls' voices because they get in the way.
Yeah. And so much of that bypassing is because I don't know what to do with it, or it's inconvenient, or it's loud. I've done that as a dad. I've done that. I'm sure I've done that at times as a spouse, and I do that with myself,
Just to add to that, I do feel that a lot of the abusive teachings for women are heavily successful because they can embed it in your conscience and in you have this spiritualized self-erasure. We see that in some, say, Elizabeth Elliot telling women to make yourself nothing, and that is the ideal of womanhood, just erase yourself. And it is successful because it's so tied, because women tend to be very interested in faith and in following Jesus, and that's a positive thing. And so when you take these other imperatives, these legalistic teachings and all that, and you attach a God wants you to do this, and the spiritual bypassing, that makes it so lethal and so abusive, because then it's not just other people outside telling you things, it's also your own conscience, and it's really horrific, and it starts very young.
Well, it's so lethal and horrific, but it's effective not for the individual that's experiencing it, but it's effective in getting short-term results to say, there, now we fix your problems.
Yeah.
So most people know you, Sheila, as, a sex guru, and especially working with empowering women to embrace the way God designed them. And you talk about sex ed, you talk about consent, you talk about protecting girls in dating relationships. So can you talk about that a little bit, and how we've looked at sexuality with girls, and how you bring scripture and a healthy perspective from your research to address that?
Yeah. Okay. That's a loaded question.
You can do it in 2 minutes.
There's a whole lot there. Yeah. Okay. Basically, what we have done over the last 20, 25 years is we've gotten rid of any idea of sex ed within the church, and we've replaced it with abstinence talk. So the only thing that matters is telling kids not to do it. So do not have sex. Do not have sex. You need to stay a virgin. And the majority of books that we looked at that were aimed at teenage girls, that's what they're all about. Let's stay a virgin until you're married. Let's make sure that you never do anything. And if the purpose is to make sure that you stay a virgin, then there is no need to give any other information in this mindset about consent. Because if we were to talk about consent, it would be implying that you might actually be in a situation where you might have sex. And since that's never going to happen because you're not supposed to do it, we don't need to talk about consent. And so they didn't talk about consent. They didn't talk about anything to do with how to make sex safe if you're going to have sex. It was just simply don't do it. And that had disastrous effects. We measured this in a variety of ways. We gave women 10 words, 10 sex ed vocabulary words. And we said, how many of these could you identify or define at the point where you graduated high school? We asked women at what age they knew that a female orgasm existed. We asked if they had a robust understanding of consent, if they could define date rape. We asked how they felt about their periods and about the messages they got about puberty. And when you take that all together, the basic thing that I can tell you is that there is no downside to more information. The more information girls have, the better they do. The better their self-esteem, the less likely they are to marry an abuser, the less likely they are to be abused or assaulted or harassed as a teenager. The more likely they are to have good marriages and sex lives when they do get married. Like, there is absolutely no downside to more information, but there's tons of downsides to not enough information. And we need to get away from this idea that teaching kids something will automatically sexualize them and will make them want to go out and have sex. In fact, the more kids know about sex ed, the less likely they are to have multiple sexual partners. We need to stop, because here's another thing. If you teach a girl that the main thing she has to do is protect her virginity, And then she's in a situation where either she goes further than she wanted to because they got carried away, or she's in a date rape situation and her virginity is stolen from her. Now, what is she supposed to do? Because the reason she was saying no was to protect her virginity. And we talked to so many women in our focus groups who said, once he had date raped me, I didn't feel like I had any right to say no anymore. Because we had taught all these girls to protect their virginity and we'd never taught them how to protect themselves.
I'm trying to think, like, even scripturally, virginity is spoken about in the Old Covenant, but where does this centrality around, like, especially female virginity, as you highlight in your book, where does it even come from? Is there, I mean, there's obviously clear biblical imperative to be pure, to engage in only monogamous sex from my perspective, within marriage. But this idea of virginity as even a concept just doesn't really seem to be much of a thing in the New Testament. Am I wrong?
I don't see it there. I would actually love to throw this question to Rebekah because she may know more.
Where did it come from?
Because I'm really curious about Rebekah's answer here.
Well, there are some research articles about marriage in the Old Testament being a transaction, because that was the culture of that time, and that was what happened after the fall. I think one of the first mentions of the word wife was like Lamech, who had 2 wives, and very, very quickly after Adam and Eve, you have this like commodification of marriage, where marriage is an agreement between a man and another man to secure one of that man's like daughters, for that guy's wife. And so virginity has been this sexualization of women as chattel almost. And you see this in the Victorian era, where the cult of true womanhood prized the female virginity, but men were very much expected to, or boys will be boys. And we've kind of carried that down all the way through history, and then we've accepted that in the church today as being like, oh yes, purity is a girl's topic. There are other things that boys deal with in purity culture, but the emphasis on protecting your virginity, we don't really hear that as much for boys in the same way. And it's certainly not like when you think of a virgin, you think of a woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Josephine Butler was an English activist in the 1900s. She was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale. And at the time, she was as well known as Florence Nightingale. We've just lost her to history. But she was called the patron saint of prostitutes. And she did a lot of work trying to raise awareness about how prostitutes are being abused, especially by the law enforcement. And then she ended up going abroad and working against child brothels. And she did all kinds of amazing things. But that was one of the big things that she campaigned about, was that as a Christian, there is no difference between what is asked of men and what is asked of women. And yet we are telling ourselves that, well, we need prostitutes because men need an outlet. Men need a natural outlet. And so that's why we need prostitution. And she's like, oh, no. Men need to be held to the same standard. And Catherine Bushnell did that in the US as well, and later in India.
Yeah, because during that time, I was reading for one of our graduate classes a book by Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And she talks about how historically in the US during that time period, a child who is sexually assaulted was seen as a fallen woman, and therefore, like, once you've lost your so-called purity, you are in the wrong. You are, like, even if it was an assault, anything, it can't be prosecuted. It becomes a way of blaming the victim and stigmatizing the victim of assault as having lost something. So there's a very dark history.
If I could just go with one reference, I, in my preparation for a sermon this last weekend, ran across this quote. This is from Leon Morris in the commentary on Matthew. He said, "The ancient world, generally it was held that a married man could have sexual adventures as long as they did not involve a married woman, which would mean violating the rights of her husband." I found this on the web. A woman,
Yes.
however, was expected to have no such relations. She should be chaste before marriage and faithful after it. And here's the clincher. The command Jesus cites makes no distinction. People of both sexes were to remain faithful. And he actually says that the idea of a man committing adultery was essentially a Christian concept. that before that, in not to say that this is what Moses taught, but in the Jewish world and Greek world, when the world Jesus was in, it was almost like he was teaching something new, that a man could commit adultery. And it's so tragic, as your book highlights. We've kind of unwound that. And we talk about, boys will be boys and they will look at porn. They will have sex, and girls just have to do everything they can to keep themselves pure.
Yeah, there's a story in the book, When God Writes Your Love Story, by Eric and Leslie Luddy, where there's a couple, they're at Christian college together, they're dating, they one night end up having sex, they get carried away. And the response to this, their commentary is that now she has lost her most precious gift. They were both virgins, but she has lost her most precious gift. Not him. Shanti Feldon, who wrote both For Young Women Only and For Young Men Only, she based them on surveys that she did. So For Young Women Only was based on a survey of boys, so telling girls what boys think, and then vice versa for Young Men Only. She asked boys, would you prefer to marry a virgin? She never asked girls, would you prefer to marry a virgin? So it's like virginity is only something that boys are interested in, apparently. So there's this tremendous double standard. And then when you combine that with our complete lack of teaching on consent and teaching that boys can't help it, and so girls need to be the gatekeepers and girls need to put the brakes on, you end up with all of these situations where girls are the victims of date rape and don't even realize it.
Can you break down, some of our audience might not even be very familiar with what the concept of consent is. Can you explain that in a nutshell and maybe even tell us how it's actually a biblical value, not just some like woke liberal?
So, okay, here's the thing. Sex, biblically, is not merely a man penetrating a woman, okay? If that's all that we think it is, then we're reducing people to animals.
Yep.
Sex is supposed to be something which is intimate. So it says in Genesis 4, verse 1, Adam knew his wife Eve, and the verb there for to know is something which is very intimate. It's a deep longing to be connected. So sex is something which is intimate. 1 Corinthians 7, we see it's something that's supposed to be mutual. It's something that's supposed to be pleasurable for both. So sex is not an act that is outside of us, that he does on her. Sex is something which you are both supposed to be participating in, and that is supposed to be about your relationship, which brings you together and which causes you to grow in intimacy and feel known. And that means that both of you have to want it. Both of you have to, and not just want it, enthusiastically want it. When one person feels like I need to have sex with him in order to prevent something bad from happening, that is no longer consensual sex. Because if you have to have sex to stop him from watching porn, as Every Man's Battle tells women, or to stop him from hitting the kids, or to stop him from yelling at you, then you are not entering into this with a free choice. And sex is not about an intimate experience. Sex is about using you to prevent him from doing something bad. And so the way that it's often described in education campaigns is that sex is an enthusiastic yes. And if you cannot truly say no, this is the thing. If you can't say no, then you cannot say yes. So if by saying no, it would bring negative consequences to her, then she is, or to him, then that person is not really able to give an enthusiastic yes. And that situation is not consensual. And we just simply have not taught that, because we have taught sex as being something which happens when someone's sex drive gets carried away. And so sex just happens. No, sex is always a choice. And we cannot say that someone was just overcome and therefore they had sex with her even when she didn't want it. No, that is always a choice.
And this is, again, some of the messages I would have grown up with. My background would have been a hands-off courtship model where not only do you not kiss, but you don't touch. You don't, maybe hold hands once in a while in a public setting. And I think that's, for some people, boundaries and guidelines and commitments like that, especially if they're done in conversation, can be really helpful. But what I heard was, if you start touching, even if it's just holding hands, it's going to start this slippery slope, this cataclysm, slow-moving, avalanche of hormones that you won't be able to stop. And we're telling ourselves this, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you can then make an excuse for yourself rather than saying, I can stop. Instead, you're saying, well, it's already too late. And it's this defeatist mentality. So not to push on take over your soapbox too much, but I'm just convinced, like you said, that even for guys, this message of not giving consent actually serves to make it harder for guys to walk in sexual purity. Which,
absolutely.
But to be clear,
absolutely.
I just want to underline the idea of a guy not walking in sexual purity. That problematic teaching pales in comparison to the idea of we're actually giving space for guys to be rapists. But both are problems.
Yes, but the reason we're giving space for guys to be rapists is because we're telling guys you can't help it. You can't help it. And that's exactly, for instance, here's the perfect example. Shanti Felden, in her book for young women only, I'm about to give you a stat, okay? I do not believe this stat. She asked this question really badly. The possible answers the guys could choose from were very badly worded, and then her interpretation of the results were, I believe, inaccurate. So the stat is not accurate whatsoever, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. This is what she said in her book, that 82% of boys showed either little ability or little responsibility to stop in a make-out situation. And her conclusion, which she put boldly in a little thought bubble, was, if you want to stop, it is safest to not even start.
And what does that mean? Like, I've walked with guys and girls that are in a dating relationship coming from a purity culture and like, well, what does it mean to not even start? And we we don't define that either.
But you know what? Even if she does start, this is the thing. Like, even if you start, even if things get hot and heavy, she can still say no. And he is more than capable of stopping. 100% of boys are capable, have the ability to stop. 100%. And that's what needs to be taught, is you can always stop. It doesn't mean that you'll be happy about stopping. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't rather keep going, but everybody is capable of stopping. Everybody is capable of maintaining consent and not coercing someone. But because we teach that boys can't stop, then if you're in a make-out situation, and we heard from so many girls, stories of date rapes. In fact, even in these books themselves, they have stories of date rape that they do not name as date rape, where the girls didn't realize it was date rape for like decades later, because they thought, well, I started kissing and he got carried away. And even though I said no, what did I expect? So Shannon Etheridge in Every Young Woman's Battle tells this story of this girl. She and her boyfriend had decided that they weren't going to go very far. He had agreed. And then as soon as they got alone, he started pushing her and she went further than she wanted to. And the conclusion was, what had she expected? She should have known. There was no talk about recognizing red flags, about consent, about, was this even a consensual experience? And we just talked to so many women who didn't recognize that it was date rape for decades until they were adults, because they thought, well, I consented to start making out, so what did I expect?
Yeah, and we have this flattening between all sin and wisdom, and then we get into issues like this is something that's I've heard some of your other interviews definitely has received pushback, but the question of modesty and whether there's any place for discussion around the lust and the male gaze in the topic of how should a woman dress and what are some valuable things that she could apply to that. So just since we're already hitting the hot button issues, do you want to touch, and Rebekah, feel free to chime in at any point here on the whole modesty question.
I'm just laughing at Rebekah shaking her head. Okay, so let me give you the data first. We measured 4 different iterations of the modesty message. So boys are visual in a way that girls can never understand. A boy can't help but lust if a girl is dressed like she's trying to incite it. A girl has a responsibility not to be a stumbling block to her brothers around her based on what she's wearing. And a girl who dresses immodestly is worse than one who doesn't. And it was up to the survey taker to figure out what worse meant. Every single one of those, terrible. Long-term terrible, reduces self-esteem, marital and sexual satisfaction go down, rates of sexual pain go up, your likelihood of marrying an abuser goes up. The 2 that are the worst are the boys' ones, the ones that are around boys. So boys are visual and boys can't help but lust. When a girl believes that as a teenager, she is 52% more likely to experience vaginismus as an adult, which is a sexual pain disorder where penetration becomes really painful, if not impossible. Often women can't even insert tampons. It's quite a problem. And if you are experiencing this and you're listening, please go see a pelvic floor physiotherapist and get The Great Sex Rescue, our other book. Talks a lot about this. They're also 68% more likely to marry an abuser. So if you believe the modesty message, you're more likely to marry an abuser. You're 30% more likely to have below average self-esteem. Like this is really serious stuff.
And you're not just saying, oh, this is bad. Or I had somebody tell me this is not anecdote. This is actual data points that you've collated.
Exactly. Like this is really bad. And when I share this, so often I get people say, oh, but what about the boys though? Like we can't like these poor boys if girls show up in yoga pants. And I'm like, no, we're going to stop asking what about the boys. And we're going to say, are you satisfied with teenage girls hearing this message and then having a 68% higher chance of marrying an abuser? Is that okay with you? So that a boy doesn't have to see a girl in yoga pants.
Why don't we ask about the boys in shorts?
Yeah, I know, and that's another question. Do we really think girls aren't visual? Because the most recent meta-analyses, and there's been 2 huge meta-analyses of this, one in, I think, 2020 and 2021, combining all of the recent research about MRI studies and brain studies about the so-called visual nature, which we're hearing about all the time, about how men are more visual. It's not true. As near as they can see, women are just as visual as men. It's just that we have higher levels of arousal non-concordance. So we're less likely to notice that we are aroused. We're more likely to discount our own arousal, whereas men are more likely to match up. And we're also aroused by different things and different stimuli than men are. And so the idea is women aren't as visual. No, we are. We are aroused visually too, but we're conditioned to discount a lot of it.
And I think for guys, we're conditioned, and you can read all the books, we are conditioned to assume we are sexually aroused primarily through sight, and specifically aroused through sight in a way that we can't fight. Mm-hmm. And that the only way to fight is by, having somebody yell Nike for us or something like that.
Which is what the Duggar girls did for their brother, yes.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, if you're struggling with sexual purity in relation to what you're looking at, and you're finding you can't help but ogle people, and that's a problem for you, yeah, I acknowledge that it could be a problem for you, and it's a problem, and you should get help. It is not their problem. So we don't want to deny an individual person's experience that maybe he's like, well, yeah, I do tend to have more visual stimulation than she does. But that's not a data point. That's one person's experience that very likely, as you said, is conditioned by what you've grown up hearing and what you've been told is okay.
Can I also jump in here and just say another big problem is that we have conflated noticing with lusting. Yes. And so we've told a whole generation of boys that if you are attracted to a girl, if you notice that she has a really nice figure and you start to feel attracted to her, you have already lusted. And so these poor 13-year-old boys have all these hormones raging through them, and they're just starting to get sexual feelings, and they're starting to notice girls' bodies, and they're thinking, I am expected to never feel any sexual feelings because sexual feelings are sinful. So it's hopeless. It's absolutely hopeless. And so they feel trapped. And that's what we've done to a whole generation of boys too. And we need to get away from this idea that just because you're attracted to someone means you've lusted after them. No, you can notice someone is attractive. And you can go, whoa, they have a nice body. And then go on with your day and think nothing more of it. And you have not sinned.
Yeah.
And there's I think the whole language of it is a culture of disrespect that you're conditioning men to think of women in a certain way. Even with the modesty message is rife with disrespect and objectification, that it's not even a different side of the same coin. It's just the same side of the same. It's the same thing. It's looking at women specifically as sexual objects, and then now blaming them as being the source of lust. As in that article that I was talking about on Twitter, where it says, oh yeah, young girls, or was it teen girls, or was it just girls in shorts, and then talking about a grown man not being able to help himself with having sexual desire. That is incredibly disrespectful and creepy. And
yeah, it totally is. It really is creepy. Mm-hmm. But this is the language that we've got. And I would argue that the Everyman's Battle solution to this, like the whole idea of the way that we get over lust is we bounce our eyes and we never look at women. That is, like you said, that is the same. It's not a different side. It is the same side of the same coin, because you're still saying she is sexual. Jesus did not refuse to look at women. Jesus chose to truly see women. Mm-hmm. And the longest recorded conversation we have of Jesus with another person is the Samaritan woman. Like he valued the voices of women. And you can't value a woman's voice if you're trying to ignore the fact that she's in front of you.
Yeah. No, and it can be such a profound impact on guys and girls, because you're not allowed to actually have a normal relationship because you've been the female body has been pre-sexualized for a guy. And then the girl has to assume that the guy is sexualizing her. And it really, really goes against the idea of being brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yep.
So definitely a huge problem. And I'm not trying to, as soon as you say, I'm not trying to both sides, people assume you are. The truth is that Christians are supposed to be held to a much higher standard than the world when it comes to sexuality, and not sexualizing other people and seeing the full person. You in your book make it clear you're not buying into the perverted mainstream Western view of female bodies either, where we should be lusting after women and it's a woman's duty to somehow, show the world everything she's got. You actually reject, both the Christian, what's the word, Rebekah? Not sexualization quite,
objectification.
But objectification. Thank you. Not both the Christian objectification through modesty and Western objectification. So, do you want to talk practically like a positive teaching that you would give, and you do give in your book, about this issue of dress?
Well,
girls?
First of all, we just simply need to separate it from any talk about lust or sexualization. If we're going to choose what to wear, those two things should not be paired. The Bible does not pair them. When the Bible talks about modesty, it's talking about not flaunting your wealth. And so if we're going to talk to our kids about how to dress, first of all, we should not be talking about to girls in a different way than we talk to boys. This conversation should be the same, whether it's girls or boys. And let's just focus on what's appropriate for the occasion. If you're going to school, you're going to learn. So let's dress to learn, right? You need to be in comfortable clothes, but you're not trying to flirt. You're not you're there to learn. If you're going to babysit, let's not wear a sundress that's going to fall over your head, go over your head if you have to get down on the ground and play with toddlers. If you're going to go water skiing, you want to wear a bathing suit that's not going to fall off, because that's going to be a lot of water that is going at you in high velocities. And that applies, just wear what is appropriate. You're going hiking, you don't want to get ticks. We can talk about things without it being about sex. And so, yeah, what's appropriate? How do I show respect to myself and others? Am I being kind with what I wear? Am I showing people that I'm not trying to keep you at arm's length? Because that was really Paul's concern when he was writing about this in Timothy, was that people were not feeling welcome when they came into the church. So think about that. If you want people to feel welcome when you come into the church and you have this elaborate dress code where everybody's getting super dressed up, are people going to feel welcome? Yep. That matters as well. And so these are just bigger questions to ask that have nothing to do with cleavage, but just what is appropriate for your age group in the culture that you're in. And if that's what everybody is wearing, it's already lost its shock value. Like, this is what I never understand with the conversations around bathing suits or around what kids wear to church because the men can't handle it. If you can't handle what a teenage girl would normally wear when you are in church to worship God, you should not be allowed to go to the mall. Like, you should never go to the beach. If you can't handle what a girl would normally be wearing, just a normal everyday girl, and you can't handle that, then why are you even going out in public?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a need to kind of counter the message that comes from the secular kind of fashion industry that is exploitative? Because we see these like studies of, say, how they're selling booty shorts to 9-year-olds with words on them. I don't know, there's something about fashion and that push to also over-sexualize the body that how do we counter these messages that promote something like, oh, you know, what the push of fashion that tells you you're beautiful if you do this. Mm-hmm. How do we have a more wholesome approach to that?
I think you just talk about it. Honestly, we need to talk about this. Like, you can ask your children, okay, with what you're wearing, is that sending a message that you don't want to send? That's what I would always ask my girls when my girls were teenagers. Like, what's the first thing you think when you look at yourself in the mirror? Do you think, oh, that is, you know, a well put together girl? Or is it, whoa, look at her body? Like, what are the first things that you think? And my girls were both very curvy. They both had, you know, they're both very attractive girls, but you can have a good body and that's not the first thing you think. You can just be, oh, she's really put together well, or, oh, you know, she looks really nice. That's a very different thing. And these are just conversations. There isn't a magic formula for this. It's just those constant conversations. And I think we need to talk to our kids about how, yeah, the world thinks that your worth is just in your sexuality, and it's not. You're worth so much more than that. And you want to show that to people. You know, you don't want to get caught up in this. There is the other side of it where when I was in university and in my 20s, mom jeans were in, right? So you had the really narrow waist that was high. It was a high-waisted, and then everything kind of parachuted out from there, and it was really baggy. And so when skinny jeans came in, and when the low-rise jeans, I just thought those are just so scandalous because that was so different from what I was wearing. And I didn't wear them for the longest time. But then eventually that's all that was for sale. And so eventually I wore them, and I actually looked pretty good in them. I kind of liked them. But by the time I was wearing them, like, so were 80% of women my age. So it kind of lost its scandalous nature. And this is the thing, once 80% of people are wearing something, it ain't scandalous anymore. And so when people complain about yoga pants, you know, Gen Z doesn't notice yoga pants. Like, Gen Z guys don't notice yoga because everybody's wearing them. But Gen X and Boomer men notice the young women in yoga pants because nobody wore them when they were young. But for Gen Z, those are not scandalous. Everyone's wearing them. And I think we just need to acknowledge that an item of clothing is not in and of itself, you know, sexual if it's a fashion that everyone is wearing. Now, if it's over-sexualized, that's something different. But once something has been adopted and it's just normal, I think it loses its power, and we've forgotten that. Like, we think, you know, crop tops are so evil, right? But I mean, for a while, like it really, once something is, everybody wears it, it's lost its shock value. And I think we just need to be a lot calmer.
There are cultures where crop tops are the traditional clothing, and showing your midriff is not at all sexual.
Yes. Like in some Asian Indian contexts.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of what you're saying, I would guess about 80% of the women listening to our podcast probably have never worn a pair of jeans of any variety. I don't know if that's true or not. Let us know. But so this is going to be really interesting to wrestle with. But here, like, the heart of what you're saying is that this trying to protect men, or the sexualization of a female body, regardless of what she's wearing, should not be part of the conversation. And
exactly.
So we're not saying you have to be comfortable wearing pants. We're not saying you have to be comfortable wearing yoga pants. But the bottom line message, as your data so clearly shows, is that when we bring these things together, it hurts girls. It hurts women.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would say, like, you talked about message. I think there's two sides of it, in the sense of we can choose what we want to communicate with our clothing, but it is never something that should be assumed, and we don't really know we can't guarantee how people are going to respond to it. Because, I mean, there are women who talk about how they would like to wear skirts, but they get sexualized more in the workplace because older men see them as more attractive. And I do feel like there is no clothing style or fashion that cannot be negatively, sexualized by people who are determined to do so, unfortunately.
It's absolutely a fool's errand to try to outrun the capacity for the human heart to be perverse.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I talked to somebody who lives in a country where she covers her face when she goes out because men will leer at her if she doesn't. And when she lived in my country, she said people saw her as a person and she didn't need to or didn't want to. But she would when she went home, because the fact that if she didn't cover her face, she would be assaulted. And so that is like, there is no, like, you cannot chase. This is a bar you cannot ever meet. To dress in any way that supposedly prevents lust, you can completely erase your body and you will still be objectified. And so it's a fool's errand, and we shouldn't be making women try to stress and have spiritual guilt based on that.
Yeah, so your book is really worth reading, so definitely check it out. But it's kind of interesting, every book is dropped into a context, and for better or for worse, your book was published on the heels of another book that made quite the splash around sexuality, which I'm also reading.
Oh, are you really?
I am.
Cool.
Yeah, we're talking about Joshua Butler's book, Beautiful Union, and that can be another conversation. But you've definitely received some pushback for your taken names, and you're calling them out, and you do these share graphics where you do some creative editing on quotes. And every once in a while, I'm like, oh, are you sure you're representing that right? Or what about the context? But ultimately, I'm in favor of the message going out. And I'm just wondering, how does it feel for you? Like, as people say, Sheila, you need to tone things down a bit, or stop attacking good people who don't say things quite just right. What are your thoughts on the whole social media conversation, or the conversation about social media conversations?
Yeah, my concern is for harm. We need to stop the harm that's being done. And quite frankly, our research is horrifying. When you look at things like the orgasm gap between men and women in the church, the rates of sexual pain that women feel, the higher rates of divorce when you believe certain things and act them out. This is bad, bad stuff. It's hurting women, it's hurting couples, it's keeping men enslaved to lust when they don't need to be.
Yep.
And it needs to be called out. It needs to stop. It looks nothing like Christ. And I think that's one thing that bothers me too. I keep feeling like I need to say, stop stealing my Jesus, because that's what you're doing when you put all of these messages with a God stamp of approval on them, which is what they have done. This is the word of the Lord. If you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with Scripture. Emerson Eggerichs says that all the time. And I'm really quite upset about that. And I feel like no one is really sticking up for your average reader. People are too concerned about how authors are going to be affected if we start calling them out. And I figure, you know what? The authors have already made a bunch of money. They have been platformed. They've had speaking engagements. Mm-hmm. Nobody is owed speaking engagements. Nobody is owed the right to write a book. These are gifts that God has and He can take away. And I just think we need to start standing up against the harm. And if you're honest, if you are following God, and if your heart is to do the best that you can in Jesus, then if someone points out that you did harm, you should be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. I am so sorry. I'm going to change that. Like I've taken 2 books out of print. I've rewritten 2 others. We moved domains recently, and I only took about 1,000 of my 3,000 blog posts because I just don't stand behind anything I said before 2018.
Wow.
Because I said a lot of stupid things. And I have changed how I speak because I've looked at data. And so I'm not asking anyone to do something I haven't done.
And does that mean that despite your definitely strong pushback against these messages, you have a lot of compassion and sympathy for people who are 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
I do. I think it's terrible. I think it would be a terrible thing to realize that you wrote something which did more harm than good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when that harm is pointed out and all they do is double down, or they blame the people who point out the harm, or they say, oh, you're doing this wrong, you're not doing this in the kingdom way, you should have come at us privately, that's not okay.
And why isn't that okay? Why don't we just approach them nicely privately?
Matthew 18 has nothing to do with public teaching. Matthew 18 is a personal offense between two people. And when there's teaching in public, it's corrected in public. The perfect example is when Paul went to Peter in front of everybody because Peter wouldn't eat with Gentiles and called him out on it. And then not only did he call him out, and Peter was like, oh yeah, my bad. And Peter stopped what he was doing and listened to Paul. Not only did Paul call him out, Paul then wrote about it. So that we would know about this forever. And then Peter, in his own letter, calls Paul's word scripture. So Peter's all good with this, right? This is the way things are done. And if you look in the New Testament epistles, you're constantly seeing both Paul and Peter naming names. This is what's done. Now, interestingly, if you take Shanti Feldon as an example, and she's a good example right now because, as Rebekah knows and has written very eloquently about, she was recently on a podcast with Preston Sprinkle where she was complaining that many people are calling out pastors and authors publicly and how this shouldn't be done. They should go in private. The thing is, in Shanti's own books, she talks about how people have come to her privately. So it's not like people haven't gone to her privately. You know, she talks about how women have come to me saying, I can't trust my husband now. And men have come to me saying, my wife won't have sex with me now that she's learned the truth about how men are wired. And Shanti's response is, so we need to explain this more to women. So I'm going to write an entire other book, this entire book through a man's eyes, that's all about how men are hardwired to because of their visual nature, to linger on, fantasize, and imagine women's bodies.
Yeah, and so most of my teaching has been as a pastor with a congregation that's somewhere between 20 people and 100 people. That is such a different place than when you're publishing a book that's been peer-reviewed and receives glowing reviews, right? And so, like, it's one thing, and I expect people, and it's happened to me, people have come up to me and said, wow, I think your sermon was off. This literally happened last Sunday. I was preaching and my wife was sitting next to me and she like paused and she said, wait, where are you getting that in scripture? and I need that because this is a community that we're working with. But if you're actually bypassing that actual organic conversation and accountability, you're choosing the venue of a public forum. And if you've chosen the venue of a public forum by writing a book, you don't have the privilege of then pulling it back and saying, no, actually, you can only approach me privately. You chose to have the conversation in a public forum. Anyway, that's my rant.
And let's say that I went to Shanti. It's not like this conversation has not happened in private, but let's say that it happened in private, and she's like, "You're right. I shouldn't have said those things. Those things were terrible and wrong, and I'm so sorry." That's great, but meanwhile, there's still people reading it, so it can't only happen in private. It has to happen in public so that the harm stops. And so, you know, these debates have to happen in the public forum. And for her saying, well, no, the Twitter mobs are wrong, what she's refusing to recognize is that it's so ironic that she was saying these things on a large podcast, on one of the largest Christian podcasts. So she has the power to get on a large Christian podcast to shape the narrative. But then she's upset that people who have no power at all are having a conversation on Twitter, which is the only way that they can speak in a public way. And she's saying, no, that needs to be shut down. So she's the only one who's allowed to speak on this publicly.
I've done takedowns and I've summarized some of these harmful teachings that basically I say it's grooming. It's teaching abusive things, lack of consent. And then people will say, that's absurd. Nobody teaches that. That's ridiculous. You know, it's far out. And so there is a need to directly address the specific teaching and with, you know, with the homework, with the footnotes, because people are reading this. And I recently did an academic presentation at a conference on some of these things that are being taught, like, oh yeah, women should be impersonal, indirect, sweet, delicate, and sexually receptive, and all that. And on all these teachings that actually amount to a lot of harm on a large scale. And people are just like jaw dropped. They cannot believe, like, my professor was like, people saying this in 2023, that. And I put in that quote from Beautiful Union, that the whole passage, I put it there, and people are just like, yeah, you kind of do have to have your receipts for what you're talking about, otherwise it seems like a lot of exaggeration and hot air, which is not the case. But there's a lot of, I feel, people have a gut reaction to seeing sort of people reacting to Butler and to now the podcast of Shanti, but they're not giving specific examples of which ones are harmful, which ones are not harmful. Like, if there were death threats, if there was bullying, like Beth Moore has faced a lot of bullying on Twitter, very obviously, and like, these things are bad. Name the specific bad things rather than make wide swooping accusations that have no specificity, because it serves to throw all criticism under the bus. That's my problem. Like,
Yeah, in your article, and we'll put a link to that, Rebekah, you talked about how dehumanizing it is to be called the mob. And I don't want to assume motives of anybody, but I think my concern with that is, if there is legitimate criticism, your tone isn't right, you're just mobbing. I don't hear people saying, oh, I want to hear the criticism, can you say it nicely? Now let's get back to the criticism. It's usually like, oh, I hear the criticism and you're not saying it nicely, so stop doing the criticism. Whether it's intended to or not, it so often just feels like a shutting down of the actual message.
And it feels exactly like the way women are told to talk to men. It's like, be conciliatory, be meek and impersonal and submissive, and don't be too direct. And like, the way that we're being told to do criticism and the way we're being told to talk to celebrities is like, yeah, it's this veneer of apologetic non-being and Christian niceness that is like, why can't we be clear and direct? But I will say there's something about the epistemology, or the way that Christians believe about theology and knowledge, that's very wrong. I love that at the beginning of the podcast you said the fruit is really important. The problem is that people who are defending these things don't care about the fruit, because they will say, what I am teaching is scripture, and if it harms people, then you're probably just doing it wrong.
Yes.
You're not they don't care about the fruit, because in that epistemology, the theology exists in this pure abstract realm where the formula is perfect, but they elevate it into an untouchable sphere of abstract formula, and you can't use like evidence, surveys, focus groups, all these things of how they actually affect women. At the end of the day, they'll say, I don't care. This is what the Bible says, and this is what you have to do because... And then they'll say, oh, God's ways are higher, all that spiritual bypassing, spiritual gaslighting language. And there's a problem with the way we think about teaching, that we're not considering the fruit. And that's why the message of people who have been abused, what they're speaking out against, is seen as a threat, and they're saying like, gaslighting survivors of abuse and saying what you're saying doesn't matter because you're too quote-unquote reactionary, you're too traumatized, and so your real experience cannot touch the untouchable sphere of a perfect doctrine.
Yeah,
I think that's very, very true. And that's why our goal, we've always said our goal is not to change the minds of the authors or the pastors or the people that speak this stuff. Our goal is to change the minds of the individuals who are following and reading these pastors and authors and organizations, and show them you don't need to do that. There's an alternative. There's another way to see Jesus. There's a healthier way that is going to keep you safe and where you can thrive. And that's where I see the purpose of She Deserves Better and The Great Sex Rescue in our other books, I may never change any author's mind, but it doesn't matter because people are listening.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this is going to be a grassroots movement. Jesus works on the margins. He wasn't too worried about winning the people in power. He was building his little band of misfits who ended up taking over the world, and while the people in power stayed in power.
Yeah, that's such a good point. The way I thought about it is this whole 99 principle, where listening on another podcast, somebody was like, well, maybe millions of people were helped by a message, and if a few thousand people didn't take it right, is that a problem? And Jesus is like, yeah, he goes after that 1% that need it. And I really do appreciate your emphasis on saying, well, it might be okay for some people, although even that's sometimes debatable, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But if it's hurting folks, we need to care for those. That's so much like Jesus. I want to close with a quote you shared. I felt like it sort of encapsulated the whole heart of the book. A quote you wrote here. This is in your second chapter. You said, if we raise girls who practice spiritual disciplines, who are a part of the same group as we are, and who successfully remain virgins, but as a result, their faith is entirely about outward signaling rather than a deep, aching desire to serve those around them, then have we really taught our girls to love God? Have we introduced them to the love, grace, or the hope, grace, love, and faithfulness of our Savior, to the joy that comes from serving Him? Or have we given them a false gospel based on outward appearance, even if the outward appearance is good and looks very, very Christian? Mm-hmm. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for your continued work. Even if some of our audience is like, oh, I'm not sure if I quite buy all this, I'm still wrestling. That's good. That's, I think, part of the reason you wrote your book.
We're not telling them to go out and buy yoga pants.
No,
but buy the book.
I don't wear yoga pants out of the house, okay? I'm just saying, let's not freak out. That's all I'm saying.
So bottom line, don't buy yoga pants, do buy the book. Or buy yoga pants with the book. Well, thanks, Rebekah, and thanks, Sheila, for your time, and blessings on your ministry there, Sheila.
Thank you.
That Jesus Podcast is part of the Kingdom Outpost Podcast Network. For more articles, podcasts, and other resources, go to kingdomoutpost.org.